This is the CFF Site's Week 9 College Fantasy Football Show. I am your host, Joe DeSalvo. And look, here we are, Week 9 already, Week 10 just around the corner. And, week 10 for me is like we're knocking on the door of the college fantasy football playoff. So we're almost there. And so as we inch closer to those double digit weeks, we're getting closer to every move being important every single week. We're just going to do a bunch of quick hitters from the last week, just some of my observations and kind of get in, kind of get out. Games have already kicked off doing this podcast a little bit late on a Tuesday. But look, that's the thing, Tuesday games. Look, here's what I would tell you, just being honest with you, from a content creation standpoint, man, these Tuesday and Wednesday games are a pain in the tail. And, Mike and I just, we put it in overdrive once when these Tuesday games start. We try to get ahead of the curve a little bit. We've done a good job of not only trying to get the Tuesday and Wednesday projections up for you DFS guys, but we've done a really good job of getting the projections up there and even trying to even rushing through my top 25 player rankings a little bit if that's what it takes to give you guys as much perspective as you can early on in a Tuesday for the guys that have to set those lineups early on in the week. But we're getting it done, and we're almost there, and we're coming close to the finish line. And, as we get closer to the finish line, just want to make an announcement. And this is something that's been in the works for a little bit. And so not only will it be good for this year, but I think it's going to be really vital or really important and powerful for some of you guys that play not only this year, but next year. But we launched, we announced on the rankings article this week, I announced a new partnership that we have with the G5 Hive. My man Stephen Motley over there at the G5 Hive, he's been working on this new tool, been telling me about it, keeping me, up to speed with all the details. A lot of cool tools, a lot of cool data, a lot of cool features over there at G5 Hive. And he, reached out to me and, just recognized the CFF site for our projections and just how good we've been at not only putting them out, but actually been really good in the projection game. And so he wanted to partner with us. That's what we've done. We've partnered with G5 Hive. We're going to power their tool by providing the projections. And really what they offer are some tools that really just kind of optimizes your lineup based on the CFF site's projections, based on your lineups in all of your leagues. You can upload your league IDs into G5 Hive, into their website from Fantrax, no matter how many leagues you play in, and it will start optimizing some of your lineups for you to help you make some of those weekly lineup decisions based on the projections, or give you some ideas, thoughts, throw some names out there for some players that may be on the waiver wire that's available. So go check them out at G5 Hive. There's a promo code. You can get it. It's called, you use the promo code CFF site G525. If you go into my top 25 weekly rankings, we have it at the top of the article. And I just wanted to give you guys a shout out at the top of the show. Go check out G5 Hive. They do a lot of good content throughout the season, even in the preseason, especially through the G5, especially their G5 content with all of the podcasts that they do. But check it out. New tool in the college fantasy football landscape, and we're happy to be partnering with the G5 Hive more, and I'll talk about it more as we go, but that may help some of you guys down the stretch. So go ahead and check them out. But let's get into looking at week 8, right? And so just going to go straight into my notes. The one thing I do my notes and observations after the game. I sit down, I look at the box scores, I check out as many games as I can. I've got 3, 4, 5 screens going on, try to make as many observations as I can from all the games. And so here's the things that really jump out at me as I not only watch the games, but I kind of think about where we started to where we're at and where we're going, right? And so we go in order of the games. And the first one I want to throw out there is just South Alabama. Let's start with there because that was an early week game. And the one thing about that South Alabama offense, it really just hasn't put up the points, especially the yards that we thought it would in the preseason. Bishop Davenport, quarterback Bishop Davenport, he's passed for fewer than 200 yards in 6 of 7 games this year. Didn't see that coming. And obviously, when you have that low volume output, that's going to affect guys like wide receiver Devin Voisin, who was a highly ranked receiver in the preseason. Now, he started out really good, but now he's gone without a score in I think 4 straight games. And so he doesn't have a 100-yard game yet this year. So Bishop Davenport, I think, really struggling a little bit to run that offense. Kentrell Bullock has been really the star in the offense, the running back. But that South Alabama offense really just hasn't been, what we were expecting in the preseason. Now, when we look at preseason, we also can go to Louisville, right? We had Isaac Brown, one of the top ranked running backs, banged up at the beginning of the year. He's now gone 4 straight games without a touchdown. Now, he does look healthy. Okay, so I think we're going to see a little bit of a turn for running back Isaac Brown down the stretch. But let's talk about wide receiver Chris Bell, right? 3 straight games of at least 135 yards receiving, and he's caught 5 TD passes in the last 3 games. And now going into week 9, with all of that momentum, one of the top wide receivers on the board in week 9, Chris Bell and that Louisville offense, or really quarterback Miller Moss, really finding the chemistry now in midseason form with wide receiver Chris Bell. Now, when we go to Miami, because we talk about that Louisville-Miami matchup, Miami, one of the top teams in the country. When I look at Miami, it's so interesting. I had a conversation with Mike earlier today, and it's just Miami's one of those teams that's really tricky when I do the projections. Like they always score more points than the projections spit out. Their running game can be off. When you look at the receivers, they've got Malachi Tony, they've got CJ Daniels. They really do not utilize more than those 2 guys in the passing game. And if Carson Beck is going to be as inefficient as he was against Louisville, I'm not so sure Miami doesn't have another couple of losses in them. But Miami's one team that the projections really just don't like for some reason, because to me, when I look at their team, when I look at the players, they just don't have some of the quality of depth and consistent productions that other top teams do. And so Miami is a team that really does concern me. Hopefully, Mark Fletcher can get that running game going this week. Now, when we talk about a running game that got going, Minnesota running back Darius Taylor decides to have a breakout game against Nebraska. 24 rushes, 148 yards, and a touchdown. And I wonder just how many fantasy owners left him on the bench. And I couldn't blame you guys if you did that. Is that a jump start to what's to come? I don't know. I still feel like that's going to be an inconsistent running game moving forward. I think, not sure, but I think so. And that to me is a little bit scary about Darius Taylor. Now, if he's fully healthy, I think what you're going to see is a heavy workload, maybe similar to what we saw last year. But again, the yards may be hard to come by. Maybe there's value for him in the passing game as it was last year, but at least a good sign if you have running back Darius Taylor on your roster after that performance in the win over Nebraska last week. And when we look at Nebraska, we have to focus on Emmett Johnson, running back Emmett Johnson, who started out really well and I think is a really good running back. But from a fantasy standpoint, it gets a little hairy because consistency hasn't been there. When you look at Emmett Johnson, he's got 8 touchdowns this season. All 8 of his touchdowns have been scored in 3 different games. So he's got 3 multiple touchdown games, which means that he's got several games in which he has not scored. And so when you look at a player like that, what it tells me, remember in the preseason, Mike and I talk about which players are better in redrafts and which players are better in best ball. When you look at Emmett Johnson and you look at his game log, that's what we mean by being good in a best ball format. Emmett Johnson has had 3 really good games, but those other 4 games have been average at best because he just hasn't found the end zone. And so he's probably doing you better in best ball formats than redraft formats. Now, San Jose State wide receiver Danny Scudero was one of the top receivers going into last week. He's been the top fantasy receiver all year, but there was some news that came out that he was questionable last week, and it certainly seemed like it. 6 catches, 25 yards. Fortunately, San Jose State gets a bye this week, gives him a chance to rest up, and hopefully the Spartans come back and Danny Scudero comes back and has a big week for you guys after getting a break. Now, staying on the West Coast, we have to talk about Cal running back Kendrick Raphael. He's hot right now. He has scored a touchdown in 3 straight games. His yardage totals have gone up in the last 3 games, and that's somebody that should be on your fantasy radar if he's not on a roster right now. Now, we look at Michigan because you had running back Justice Haynes has been tearing it up this year. And then he was in my top 25 rankings last week. I put a Q by him because he was questionable. And if he was questionable, that was going to make Jordan Marshall a must start last week. Jordan Marshall, without Justice Haynes there, runs 25 times, 133 yards, and a touchdown. And so now the attention turns back this week on whether or not Justice Haynes is healthy. And I would hope maybe for you guys that have Jordan Marshall, maybe you have both players. Maybe Justice Haynes gets to sit again this week. You don't see him. He gets fully healthy. If Justice Haynes is out, Jordan Marshall is, in fact, a top 15, top 10 running back this week. But while we're on Michigan, I do think it's worth to mention our guy, wide receiver Andrew Marsh, who has had 3 consecutive solid outings. And now, remember, they went out and got McCulley, the transfer from Indiana, but Marsh is now looking like that receiver in the passing game that's making a little bit of a difference in that offense. And so let's keep an eye on him. I think I might have put him there at wide receiver 25 this week, maybe a little bit optimistic, but 3 straight solid outings for Michigan, and they play the Spartans this week. Now, as we go to Georgia Tech, one note on Georgia Tech, because we've talked about, I've talked about Georgia Tech the beginning of the year. Their schedule looked good, then they've struggled. I felt like, depending on which Georgia Tech team shows up, they could beat almost any team in the ACC. They could almost lose to any team in the ACC. But one important note, quarterback Haynes King, 10 rushing touchdowns on the season, his third straight 10 rushing touchdown season. And I think they showed this graphic in the game last week. I think that may have tied Lamar Jackson, who had 3 seasons of 10 touchdowns rushing. So good company there for quarterback Haynes King from Georgia Tech. Now, another quarterback, and I felt like, look, this has kind of been the year for me of bashing the quarterbacks, whether we're talking Arch Manning, whether we're talking Cade Klubnik. I feel like I've mentioned Lenora Sellers a couple of times already, and I'm just going to keep going in on him. I just cannot believe how bad that South Carolina offense looks. And it's amazing how Lenora Sellers went from what his coach described to be the best player in the country last year. Well, we know that's not close, because even, you want to talk about the best player in the country. Remember when Lamar Jackson was quarterback in Louisville? They didn't have the best team, but that guy was the best player in the country. And man, they at least showed up every week and they were putting up points. They didn't run the table. But if you're the best player in the country, that's how you can affect the game. That's how you carry an offense. And Lenora Sellers right now, he went from his coach describing him as the best player in the country to I don't see anything. He doesn't even look like a good quarterback, right? Now, let's go back to the non-power conferences, because Buffalo running back Al-Jay Henderson has been getting a lot of he's been getting a lot of heat, particularly in the Discord. I feel like there has been a meltdown over the past couple of weeks. He's getting the heavy workload that we want. I talk about it all the time. I want to target the heavy, high volume backs. When you look at Al-Jay Henderson, he's got 4 games this year in which he's gotten at least 20 rush attempts. The yards per carry is not there. I mentioned this earlier in the season. I think there could be an offensive line issue there. There are some people wondering whether or not he's just banged up if he's hurt. But also keep in mind, he's caught 22 passes for 172 yards. He's averaging 7.8 yards per reception. I'm not particularly sure this is an Al-Jay Henderson issue. I think there's a deeper issue along the offensive line. He's getting the volume, guys. He's just not getting that. He's not getting the 100-yard game. He's not scoring the touchdowns. It's just hasn't been there. Everything that we wanted in the formula is there, except something's off in that offensive line. Now, we go to another non-power conference running back, and we go to Boise State, where Dylan Riley has, Boise State running backs, they've had 4 100-yard games. All of them have been by Dylan Riley. And I think there's some debate. Remember, it was like, is it Sire Gaines? Is it Malik Sherrard? Dylan Riley comes in there. He bursts for that 200-yard game. I think we've pretty much gotten to the point now where I recognize Dylan Riley. And I said this 3 or 4 weeks ago. Dylan Riley, to me, as I watched a lot of the past games and last year's footage, he just looks like the best runner of the group. And I think we're getting to the point now where I believe Dylan Riley is a start every week. He doesn't need 20 touches to make a difference. He's got 4 100-yard games. I know he's got a 200-yard game. I just feel like that he is a must start every week, particularly for you guys that are in deep leagues. Sticking non-power conference as well. Ohio, Saban Gora, 100 yards in 3 of the last 4 games, and he had 3 touchdowns this past week against Northern Illinois. I think he's ready. Like we talked about Parker Navarro, we talked about him, how he has not been there, but I feel like Saban Gora is kind of turning that corner. You've got Chase Hendricks at receiver, you've got Saban Gora, 3 touchdowns last week, over 100 yards in 3 of the last 4, and I think he could be primed to make a good run here down the home stretch. I want to give a shout out to SMU wide receiver Jordan Hudson. Remember Jordan Hudson? I believe it was maybe he was over at TCU a couple of years ago, comes over to SMU. We talk about really there's no go-to receiver over at SMU. And now all of a sudden now, if you look at that SMU offense, Jordan Hudson has caught a touchdown pass in 3 of the last 4 games. All of a sudden now he's developed into a little bit of a go-to receiver for Jennings, right? And I think more so what the attention needs to go to is at the running game, because I think everyone has given up on TJ Harden, right? Remember, TJ Harden started out the gate really fast. As I watch SMU and as I look at the backfield and I look, even though Harden seems to be leading in touches, to me, Chris Johnson Jr. is slowly taking over the lead in that backfield. Wouldn't surprise me if another week or two that Chris Johnson even gets more touches, depending on what happens with SMU down the stretch. I think they have a big game with Miami coming up after this week. Now, we'll stick with another running back, and I will take the blame for this one because I may have cursed him, but Texas Tech running back Cameron Dickey, he's just been lights out all year. And I finally was like, you know what? There's no way that guy's not a top 5 running back this week. He goes and has the worst performance of the season on the road against Arizona State last week. Texas Tech gets beat by the Sun Devils. I expect a bounce back game this week for Cameron Dickey and that Texas Tech offense. Sticking in the state of Texas, though, remember we were talking about how Le'Veon Moss was out. Reuben Owens going to take over that running back 1 spot. 2 touchdowns in the game against Arkansas. And as long as Owens looks like he's got that prime running back 1 role, I think he's a must start. Texas A&M gets LSU this week. A little tougher defense, but I still think he's going to find a way. They're going to find a way to get him in the end zone. Now, well, as we talk about backfields that seem a little bit more unclear, there's a lot of back and forth in regards to Oregon. Noah Whittington had a big week last week. It always seems like somebody's having a big week. I mean, you kind of feel like Davison is good for a touchdown every week, but I don't think we're going to see a high volume guy in that Oregon backfield. They're just too deep. We already saw what happened with Mekhi Hughes. And as long as they're winning and as long as they're feeding the guys the ball, there's nobody that's going to leave that program. So if they're winning and they can distribute it evenly across, I don't see any reason for them to give one guy 15 to 20 touches. For me, I just think unless you're looking for a consistent touchdown, Davison's your guy. If not, stay away from the Oregon backfield. Stay away from the Oregon backfield. Now, Rutgers, again, we were talking about Cameron Dickey last week. I think it was Antoine Raymond. He had scored a touchdown in every game up until last week, so I still had faith that he would score against Oregon. Did not score. It was the only game this year that Antoine Raymond did not score. There was a little bit of a theme, even I think it was quarterback Colton Joseph for Old Dominion as well. It seemed like there were a lot of good players last week that hit a season low last week. And for some reason, there were a lot of big names that did that. One player that did not happen to was Georgia Southern receiver Camden Brown, he's kind of emerging as a top 10 receiver on a week-to-week basis. He has caught a touchdown pass in 6 of 7 games, and he's gone over 100 yards in 3 of the last 4. And as we look at the season and we look at all these teams that are on buys, Camden Brown probably consistently, looks like he's going to be a top 10, 12, 15 receiver from here through the rest of the year. Now, I was referencing a little bit earlier how Haynes King had 10 rushing touchdowns. Now, we're not talking Navy here. We're not talking Army. We're not talking Air Force, right? But another quarterback that needs to be recognized for 10 rushing touchdowns is Mark Gronowski over at Iowa. Now, he's only got three touchdown passes. I don't really see him as a fantasy factor. Matter of fact, Mark Gronowski's emergence in the running game really has killed Kamari Mouton and any running back being really a big factor in college fantasy football. And it has to do with Mark Gronowski. 10 rushing touchdowns on the season for Iowa. And they're coming. He had that big run in the fourth quarter down the stretch with that go-ahead touchdown against Penn State this past weekend. And as we look at Penn State, the one thing that I see is running back Katron Allen. Now, he has scored a touchdown, at least one touchdown, in all 7 games this year. And I just wonder, has running back Nicholas Singleton, has he packed it in? Has he folded the tent, or is that just the way the offense is set up? He hasn't scored a touchdown, I think, in a while, and I think 39 yards might have been his highest rushing output, maybe in the last 4 weeks, or really close to that. Just doesn't, like, right now, Katron Allen's a start, and to me, Nick Singleton is not. And that's kind of taken a role reversal from where we were at the beginning of the year. Now, Texas survives against Kentucky. Again, year of bashing the quarterback. Arch Manning just doesn't look like it. But as long as Texas's defense and special teams are playing like the way they're going to play, Texas is going to be in or almost beat any team possible as long as Arch Manning doesn't make mistakes. I almost feel like if Arch Manning just learns to manage the game and doesn't turn it over, that Texas defense is good enough, not saying to win, but good enough to keep them in the game every single week. And with the emergence of Ryan Niblett in the return game, he's probably the reason why they've won two of the, main reason why they won that game at Oklahoma, and probably why they beat Kentucky, because that first touchdown drive that Texas had was a 4-yard drive following a big punt return from Niblett. And so the Texas defense special teams playing lights out and really carrying that team. Now, let's look at Pitt, because Desmond Reed came off of that big game, and then all of a sudden there's questionable. He barely played. I just don't know if you can start Desmond Reed right now. Like, we are in week 9, and I don't know if we can really take a chance on getting a 25-yard performance from Desmond Reed right now. It's a really shame to say that, because we're this deep in the season. You would think that he didn't come back unless he was really fully healthy, but apparently he was hardly practicing leading up to last week, which is the reason why he didn't play much. And now I'm wondering how much playing time will he actually get this weekend. And so it really is a roll of the dice with Desmond Reed right now. Where it's not a roll of the dice is South Florida running back Byron Brown. I touched on it last week. Look, this was a preseason top 1 or 2 quarterback for us last year. He got injured. He never did come back. And he started off the year, South Florida, with that strong schedule, was worried about him getting hurt again. He didn't get hurt. He just went ahead and beat Florida in the swamp. And then all of a sudden now, South Florida, to me, this game, South Florida-Memphis, looks like the game for me that determines which non-power conference team could be representing the non-power conferences in the college football playoff. And it's a shame, because it looks like Brendan Lewis, and I'm going to touch on him in a minute, he's going to be questionable for this week's game. So it looks like, even though Memphis gets the game at home, kind of curious if whether or not they have a healthy Brendan Lewis for this matchup. But Byron Brown absolutely lights out and is going to be one of the top quarterbacks on the board this week. I was talking about all kind of good games last week. Alabama, Tennessee was one of them. You just wonder how that game plays out differently, if not for the pick six on the last play of the first half. You look at Oklahoma State, Sam Jackson. I mentioned anybody that picked him up a couple of weeks ago and started him actually got burned because he may have had negative points. He started again last week, and I still don't think you got enough points out of him to really justify starting him right now. It's a shame, but to me, you have an out-of-position player playing quarterback, and you just can't get anything from him because that's how poor Oklahoma State looks offensively. Now, we go to BYU from a team that doesn't look poor to a team that looks consistent. And LJ Martin and Bear Backmeyer really just carrying that team. The freshman, that quarterback doing a good job. And I feel like LJ Martin really is not getting some recognition that he deserves, but he is really carrying the ground game over at BYU. Now, when we look at the ground game, we could talk about Utah because that was a big win for BYU over Utah, right? So all year, all fantasy owners were like, okay, we've got Nachary Rogers, we've got Wayshawn Parker, we've got Devin Dampier at quarterback, and now all of a sudden Daniel Bray enters the mix, right? And he's a little bit more of their speed guy. I just don't know right now if you can start a Utah running back, and then when we talk about running backs, we got to go look at Oregon State because Oregon State drew that matchup against Lafayette last week. And I was mentioned, I think, in my notes and observations the week before, how Anthony Hankerson, how his touchdowns have been drastically different from what they were last year. He went into the weekend with 2 rushing touchdowns, and against Lafayette, he had 4 touchdowns, right? So he doubled his touchdown total in one game. What does that mean going forward, though? I still think there is some concern because of the inefficiencies of the Oregon State offense. Could that be a game to jumpstart Anthony Hankerson and the running game for Oregon State? Possibly. But let's just face it, they played Lafayette. That was not unexpected. I ranked them high. The projections had them high. We need to really see where this is going to go. And I don't feel overly confident that this is just going to jumpstart a touchdown barrage by Anthony Hankerson over at Oregon State. Now, where I do see momentum building, though, is in the Tennessee backfield, right? You had Lewis, you've got Star Thomas at the beginning of the year. All 3 of those guys were getting touches. And just 4 or 5 weeks ago, I was on this show saying that it looked like every time Star Thomas touched the ball, he was doing the most with his touches. But I have to tell you, Deshaun Bishop has really come on, right? He's got 4 straight games with a touchdown. He has rushed for 269 yards in the last 2 games. And for me, he seems to be separating himself in that Tennessee backfield. Remember, I said this on last week's show. I think it was last week's show when I was talking about Notre Dame running back Jordan Love, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, where you got Jadarian Price and you had Jeremiah Love. And it just felt like they were giving Jeremiah Love a little bit more love, right? And he was getting some more touches. So he went out last week, exploded against USC, 24 carries, 228 yards, and a touchdown. And I kind of feel like Deshaun Bishop is kind of developing into that. Even though I don't think he's had more than 14 rush attempts in the last 2 games, it feels to me like he's a guy that you could start every week and be okay with, right? And so with that being said, that's going to take us through all of the games. Now, look, first of all, let me just say this. I'm quite surprised that 2 guys are still employed. I thought Hugh Freeze, Auburn losing at home and blowing that game to Missouri. I thought Hugh Freeze was going to be gone Monday morning. And when Florida State lost that game to Stanford, I immediately thought that Norvell may have been gone on Monday. Come to find out, it seemed like Norvell was closer to being gone than Freeze. But we'll see. Auburn gets Arkansas this week. Who knows? Could be Freeze's last game, but we did see, and I think this was something to talk about quarterback bashing, right? I've been talking about Jackson Arnold all season. He's just not it. It seems like he is splitting reps with Ashton Daniels in practice. Would not be surprised to see the Stanford transfer get a shot this week. And then other than that, as we look forward to week 9, and I think it's important to note because here's some things we'll be tracking because early in the week, we don't get a ton of updates. Projections, as I do them, there's a lot of gaps right now. When I say gaps, a lot of question marks, right? You've got Ian Strong. We're going to be keeping eyes on him over at Rutgers. I mentioned Brendan Lewis, the quarterback for Memphis. We have to see what's going on with him. Will he try to play? You've got Chip Trayanum, who didn't play in the last game against Toledo. Will he come back? Is he hurt? Terrence Carter, the tight end for Texas Tech, left banged up. I'm doubtful that I don't feel good that he'll play. Of course, you've got Justice Haynes. That's going to affect whether or not Jordan Marshall ends up in some lineups. And then even running back like Turbo Richard over at Boston College. That's just a few of the names we'll be monitoring as the week gets a little bit longer in the tooth. We inch closer to the weekend. And again, week 9 is here. We're knocking on the doorstep of the college fantasy football playoff. So that's going to do it. Again, One more time, go check out the new partnership at G5 Hive. Go check them out. Go check out the new tools they have. Go play around with the website, see what they have to offer, but a good chance to optimize your lineups using the CFF sites projections that we're partnering up with those guys. But that's it. That's going to do it for week 9. Good luck to everybody this week. I did not give a shout out to the 4-1 Super Fantasy League, but you guys get your shot next week. Good luck, everyone. I'll see you in week 10.